He only needed coffee, but what Keanu Reeves witnessed in that grocery store checkout line would haunt him forever. An elderly veteran, shaking, forced to choose between food and his heart medication. Keanu stepped forward. But what happened next revealed a hidden bond neither man could have imagined. Who was this stranger, and why did it feel like fate? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The rain had been falling steadily over Los Angeles for hours, soaking the streets and painting the sky in moody hues of gray, the kind of downpour that made most people stay in, but not Keanu Reeves. After a long, emotionally draining day on set, filming a particularly heavy scene for a new indie drama, he felt the need to be alone. The studio had offered him a driver, but he declined. He wanted to decompress the way he always did, quietly, without fanfare, without being seen. He pulled his modest black SUV into a small corner grocery store just past Koreatown. The place wasn't trendy or flashy, just a neighborhood staple with cracked pavement in the parking lot and a rusted sign that flickered when it rained. It was exactly what Keanu was looking for. Ordinary. Dressed in a simple dark hoodie, jeans, and a plain baseball cap pulled low, he hoped to be invisible. That was easier said than done for someone with one of the most recognizable faces in the world. But in this part of town, tucked into a street lined with laundromats and mom-and-pop diners, most people minded their own business, and that suited him perfectly. He stepped out into the rain, pulling the hood over his head, his boots splashing through shallow puddles. The cold air bit through his clothes, but he didn't care. In fact, he welcomed it. It felt real. Inside the store, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly. The aisles were narrow, stacked with practical goods, nothing fancy. The kind of place you came to for eggs, canned beans, or dish soap. Not the kind of place one expected to cross paths with someone like Keanu Reeves. And yet, here he was, his steps slow, deliberate, unbothered by the musty smell of wet linoleum and old cardboard. He didn't need much, just a few things to get through the night. A loaf of sourdough bread, some Fuji apples, a small tin of espresso beans, a bar of dark chocolate. He didn't plan to eat all at once, but probably would. He placed each item in a small handheld basket and made his way to the front of the store. The rain continued to pound the roof above. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. The checkout line was longer than usual for a Tuesday evening, mostly due to one of the registers being closed. He waited patiently behind a young couple with a toddler, then an older woman who argued gently with the cashier about the price of rice. None of it bothered Keanu. If anything, it gave him time to breathe. Then he saw him. A man, maybe in his 80s, stood a few places ahead in line. His shoulders were stooped beneath a threadbare army green jacket. A faded navy cap sat on his head, with the word Vietnam stitched across the brim in gold thread. His shoes were soaked, his pants clung to his thin legs from the rain. In one hand he held a modest wire basket. His other hand trembled slightly as he rested it on the counter for balance. Keanu's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but with a quiet awareness. There was something in the way the man moved, cautious, deliberate, and alone. He watched as the man placed a few simple items on the conveyor belt. 3 cans of chicken noodle soup, a loaf of wheat bread, a quart of milk, a tiny box of heart medication. That was it, nothing more. The cashier greeted the man with a warm, familiar tone, calling him by name Mr. Thompson. And for a moment, it felt like time slowed down. Keanu shifted his weight, slightly, his eyes fixed ahead, unaware that he was holding his breath. What he didn't know was that he was about to witness something that would change both of their lives forever. The cashier, a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle voice, scanned each item slowly, treating the elderly man with quiet respect. Her name tag read Gabriella. She smiled and asked softly, "How's the knee feeling today, Mr. Thompson?" The man let out a raspy chuckle. "It's not the knee that's the problem today. It's the weather. It's getting into all the bones these days." Keanu heard the exchange and felt something stir inside him. It wasn't pity, he knew better than to call it that. It was something deeper, recognition maybe. A sense that he'd seen this kind of quiet dignity before. It reminded him of his own father in his final days. Or maybe of the elderly extras he'd chat with on film sets. Those who'd seen too much, earned too little, but carried on anyway. As Gabriella bagged the groceries in a thin plastic sack, she gave the total. "That'll be $42.10, Mr. Thompson." The man began digging into his coat pocket, pulling out a worn leather wallet. He opened it slowly, carefully thumbing through bills that were mostly ones and fives. Then he reached into his other pocket and retrieved a handful of coins. The sound of change clinking against the counter filled the quiet air around them. "Let's see now," he murmured, counting softly under his breath. 5, 10, 27, 36. Gabriella waited patiently, but the line behind him had grown. People shifted, sighed. A man a few spots behind Keanu checked his watch and groaned audibly. "I'm sorry," Mr. Thompson said, his voice faltering. "I thought I had enough. I must have miscalculated." Gabriella leaned forward. "It's okay. Take your time. Do you want to remove something?" The man's hands trembled as he picked up the small box of medication. His eyes lingered on it, then lowered. "Take off the medicine," he said. "I can get by without it for a few more days. The soup's more important right now." Keanu's heart dropped. He wasn't the type to jump into situations uninvited, but something about this moment felt different. It wasn't just an old man at a register. It was a decision between nourishment and survival, between a warm meal and a working heart. And no one should have to make that choice, not in line for groceries, not in this city, not in this country. Keanu stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice cutting through the growing silence. "May I?" Gabriella looked up, surprised. Mr. Thompson turned slowly to see who had spoken. Keanu pulled his wallet from his back pocket and held out a card. "Please, let me take care of it." Mr. Thompson blinked up at the man standing beside him. For a moment, he didn't recognize the face beneath the soaked hoodie and ball cap. All he saw was a stranger offering help. "I appreciate it," he said quietly, "but I couldn't let you do that. I'm just a little short this week. My pension hits Friday. I'll be fine." Keanu didn't flinch. His voice remained calm, steady. "It's just groceries. Let me do this. No expectations, no strings. Just let me help." Gabriella glanced between them, sensing the sincerity in both men. She hesitated, then slowly reached for the card. Mr. Thompson looked at Keanu again. This time, his eyes squinted just a little. A flicker of recognition passed over his face. "You look familiar," he said. "Do I know you?" Keanu gave a small, warm smile. "Probably not, but I'm honored you'd think so." Gabriella completed the transaction and placed both men's groceries into separate bags. She handed the card back to Keanu with a quiet, "Thank you, Mr." Thompson stood still for a second, as if absorbing the moment. Then, with a slow nod, he extended his hand. "My name's Harold. Harold Thompson." Keanu shook it gently. "Keanu? It's nice to meet you, Harold." Harold gave a half laugh, a quiet breath of surprise. "Keanu Reeves? Well, I'll be." Keanu smiled but said nothing, just helped him gather his bags, his own groceries tucked neatly under one arm. The line behind them began to move again. The noise of the store returned, beeping scanners, rustling bags, soft music playing overhead. But something about the energy had shifted. As they reached the automatic doors, the rain outside had thickened, now falling in heavy sheets that blurred the parked cars and lit street signs beyond. Harold looked out at the storm and hesitated. He adjusted the cane in his right hand, his fingers tightening slightly on the handle. "It's a bit of a walk to the bus stop," he murmured. "Didn't think it would come down this hard." Keanu looked at him, then to the rain, then back again. "I have my car just around the corner," he said. "Let me give you a ride. No reason for you to get drenched." Harold paused, pride warring with reason. Then he nodded. "Thank you, Keanu. I think I'll take you up on that." And with that quiet agreement, two men, one famous, one forgotten, stepped into the rain, unaware that this small moment would become the beginning of something unforgettable. The store was warm compared to the rain-soaked parking lot, but Mr. Harold Thompson still felt the chill. Not in his body, he had long grown used to the stiffness in his knees, the ache in his hip, the quiet war his bones waged every time the weather changed. No. The chill was something deeper. It came from standing under the fluorescent lights at the checkout lane, aware of how many eyes were behind him and how light his wallet felt in his hand. He tried to move quickly. He didn't like holding up the line. He gently placed each item on the conveyor belt with the care of someone used to making things stretch 3 cans of soup, a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, a pack of crackers, and the one item he needed most, a small white box with his prescription printed across the side in fading ink. Heart medication, a refill he couldn't ignore. He looked up and saw the young cashier at the register. She noticed him immediately and offered a soft smile. "Good evening, Mr. Thompson," she said kindly. "Staying dry out there?" "Barely," Harold replied with a chuckle. "That rain's got a mean streak tonight. I almost slipped in the parking lot. Thought these old legs were going to fold under me like a cheap card table." Maria Lopez had been working the register at that store for 2 years. She knew most of the neighborhood regulars by name. But Mr. Thompson, he was special. Always polite, always kind. He never complained, even when his cane slipped or his fingers shook too much to grab the receipt. "Take your time," she said gently, starting to scan the items one by one. "I've got all night." "Wish I did," Harold replied with a tired grin. "The bus sure doesn't wait." Maria placed the items in a single paper bag, double-bagged at the bottom. She knew Harold didn't ask for help unless absolutely necessary. She also knew his left hand didn't have the strength it used to. "That'll be $43.65, Mr. Thompson." Harold gave a small nod, already opening his wallet. It was worn leather, creased and soft with age. Inside were a few crumpled bills and some change he'd sorted into a little coin pouch. He counted slowly, the way someone does when they've done this before. When every penny matters. 5, 10, 15, he whispered. Behind him, the line started to grow. A woman with a baby in a stroller shifted uncomfortably. A teenager behind her pulled out his phone and scrolled impatiently. Harold kept counting. 30, 35, 37, 39. His fingers trembled as he dug deeper into his coat pocket. He pulled out a few more coins and placed them on the counter. 40, 41, 42, 42.55. He stopped, blinked at the coins, then looked up slowly. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. I thought I had enough." Maria leaned in slightly, lowering her voice so others wouldn't hear. "You're just a little short, Mr. Thompson. We can take something off if you'd like." Harold nodded slowly, his eyes falling to the paper bag in front of him. His hand hovered over the groceries for a moment, then settled on the white prescription box. He picked it up with visible hesitation. "This one," he said quietly. "Take this off." Maria looked at him, concern etched in her expression. "That's your heart medication." "I know," he said, forcing a half smile. "But I'll be fine. I'll pick it up when my check comes in next week." "You sure?" she asked softly. Harold gave a quick nod, not looking at her. Keanu, standing just 2 spots back, had heard every word. He stayed quiet, watching the exchange. There was something about the way Harold handled himself, not with drama, not with complaint, just quiet resignation. Like a man who had learned to live with, doing without. The young man behind Keanu groaned. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for the others in line to hear. "It's just soup and pills. How long does it take?" Harold stiffened slightly, but said nothing. Maria, trying to move things along, gently pulled the medication aside and recalculated the total. "That brings it down to $38.20, she said. Harold resumed counting his coins. His hands shook slightly now, not just from age, but from embarrassment. Keanu could feel it. The discomfort, the weight of pride, the sting of having to choose between dignity and survival. He glanced down at his own basket, just a few simple items. He could have been out of the store 5 minutes ago, but something rooted him there. His fingers tightened around the strap of his basket. The woman with the stroller shifted again, rocking her baby back and forth. The sound of quiet frustration moved down the line like a ripple. Harold finally pushed the last coins forward. That should cover it now. Maria counted quickly, confirming it. She nodded gently and gave him a warm smile. "You're all set, Mr. Thompson." She handed him the paper bag, double-bagged, as always. But Harold's eyes lingered on the medication box, now sitting off to the side. His shoulders slumped a little. "Thank you," he said, lifting the bag with effort. "Sorry for holding everyone up." Keanu's voice came softly, just behind him. "You didn't hold anyone up. You reminded them what patience looks like." Harold turned around slowly. He hadn't heard the man approach, and when he did, his eyes met a face half hidden beneath a soaked hoodie and a humble smile. Keanu took a step closer. "Please, let me cover the rest." Harold looked at him in disbelief. His fingers tightened around the grocery bag, and his eyes blinked hard, as if trying to make sense of the stranger's offer. "I appreciate it," he said gently. "I really do. But I'm not one to ask for handouts." "It's not a handout," Keanu replied. "It's just a moment, one person helping another." There was no fanfare in his voice, no grandstanding, just sincerity. Calm, warm sincerity that made it feel less like charity and more like shared humanity. Harold hesitated. Then, without fully realizing what he was doing, he nodded. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the ache in his legs. Or maybe it was because something in Keanu's voice made it feel okay to accept. Keanu turned to Maria. "Can you ring the medication back up?" Maria scanned the box again and placed it gently into Harold's bag. She gave Keanu a small, knowing look as she handed him the receipt. "Thank you, sir." Keanu gave a subtle nod. No receipt needed. Harold's eyes drifted to the bag, now complete again. Everything he needed. All still his. Still in his hands. He turned back toward Keanu, the weight of emotion beginning to catch up with him. "I don't know what to say," he murmured. "No need," Keanu said, brushing it off with a kind smile. "Just get home safe." That's when Harold really looked at him closely. The voice, the face, the presence. It all clicked into place. "You're Keanu Reeves," he said slowly, eyes widening. "Aren't you?" Keanu shrugged with a quiet laugh. "I get that sometimes." Harold smiled, not with awe, but with appreciation. "Well, that explains a lot. You've always had a reputation for being decent." "I just try to do my part," Keanu replied. "You've done yours." They stood there a moment longer, two strangers bound by something more than circumstance now. Keanu gently gestured toward the entrance. "Do you have a ride home?" "No, just the bus stop down on Alvarado, about 6 blocks. I'm used to it." Keanu glanced outside. The rain hadn't let up. If anything, it had gotten heavier. "That's too far in this weather," he said. "Let me drive you." Harold raised an eyebrow. "You've done enough already. It's no trouble. My car's close, and you've got groceries and a cane. Let me help." Harold paused, then gave a slow, grateful nod. "All right. I'd be a fool to say no again." They stepped toward the exit together, pushing the door open into the storm. The rain poured, but the cold didn't matter now. Something had begun. Something neither of them could see coming. The air between them shifted as they stepped toward the door. Harold walked slowly, his cane clicking softly against the tile floor, the paper bag balanced in his other hand. Keanu stayed close, keeping just enough distance to not make it awkward, but ready in case Harold needed support. Outside, the rain was falling harder now. It clattered against the windows in fast-moving sheets, the parking lot shimmering under the glow of flickering streetlights. Maria watched the two men from behind the counter, her hand still on the receipt printer. She didn't say anything, but her eyes followed them as they moved. Harold stopped just before the automatic doors. "I'm not used to this," he said without turning around. "People stepping in, Not anymore. Keanu's voice was calm. Maybe that's the problem. Harold gave a soft, tired laugh. Used to be. Back when I was teaching, I always told my students, never let pride cost you more than it has to. Funny how I forgot my own advice. Keanu looked at him. Pride's not bad. It keeps us standing when life knocks us around. But sometimes, it also keeps us from reaching out. Harold shifted his weight, staring out at the wet sidewalk. He tightened his grip on the grocery bag. That medication, I usually space it out when I run low. Take it every other day. Not ideal, but it gets me through. You shouldn't have to do that, Keanu said. I know, but what else do you do when the choice is between eating and breathing? Keanu didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence said enough. Harold exhaled, then turned to face him. You really sure you want to give a stranger a ride in the rain? Keanu shrugged. You're not a stranger anymore. That answer seemed to land somewhere deeper than Harold expected. He nodded once, slowly, and stepped out into the rain. Keanu followed closely, lifting his own grocery bag with one hand and reaching to take Harold's in the other. The older man hesitated for half a second, then let Keanu carry it without a word. Together, they walked through the downpour. Rain soaked through Keanu's hoodie almost immediately, but he didn't flinch. Harold's coat was too thin for the weather, but he pressed on, his cane tapping with each careful step. Maria watched them disappear through the glass, her fingers still resting on the edge of the counter. She had recognized him the moment he spoke, but she said nothing. That, too, was a quiet form of respect. Outside, Keanu led Harold toward a black car parked just a few spaces from the entrance. He opened the passenger side door first, helping Harold ease himself inside before circling back around to the driver's seat. Neither of them knew it yet, but this wasn't just a ride. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Inside the car, the heater kicked on with a low hum, slowly pushing back against the chill. Harold exhaled, the sound more tired than relieved, and wiped his wet glasses with a folded handkerchief. Keanu placed the grocery bags on the floor near Harold's feet, careful not to crush the eggs. Let me know where to go, Keanu said gently as he buckled in. Harold gave a quiet nod. Straight down Alvarado, then a right on 8th, apartment complex with the blue railing. Keanu put the car into gear and pulled out of the lot, wipers squeaking across the windshield as the rain intensified. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The city around them blurred wet sidewalks, neon signs flickering in the storm, the occasional pedestrian rushing by beneath umbrellas or soaked jackets. Then, Harold broke the silence. You didn't have to do any of this. I know, Keanu said, keeping his eyes on the road. That's what makes it rare. Harold looked down at the bag between his feet, at the white box of medication tucked safely inside. His fingers gently brushed over the edge of the paper. You know, he continued, I taught for 34 years. High school history. I used to be the guy people called when they needed help. Now I'm the one standing in line, counting nickels. Keanu nodded slowly. You still carry the weight of everything you gave. That doesn't go away. Harold turned his head, studying the man beside him. You're not like most celebrities. Keanu gave a half smile. That's probably true. There's no cameras here. No entourage. Just you in a hoodie, buying bread and coffee. I like quiet nights, Keanu said, especially after long days pretending to be someone else. Harold gave a short laugh. You're good at pretending, but you seem more real than most. The car rolled to a stop at a red light. Outside, the storm lit up for a second with a flash of distant lightning. Inside, it was still. Calm. You know, Harold said after a moment. When you offered to pay, I almost said no. I could tell, Keanu replied. I didn't want to be someone's charity story. Didn't want to feel small. You didn't look small, Keanu said. You looked like someone who had held the world up for a long time, and maybe just needed someone to carry a corner of it for a minute. Harold's throat tightened. He turned back to the window, blinking hard. You got away with words, he said quietly. Keanu didn't respond. He just drove, letting silence do its part. They pulled into the modest apartment complex, just as the rain softened into a quiet drizzle. The building was old, but clean, with chipped blue railings and a narrow walkway that wrapped around the second floor. The street lights flickered slightly, casting a warm hue across the damp pavement. Keanu eased the car to a stop near the curb. Before Harold could unbuckle, Keanu stepped out and quickly made his way to the passenger side, opening the door. He reached in without a word, took the grocery bags, and offered a steady hand as Harold climbed out slowly. Harold looked down at his feet, then up at Keanu. "You really don't have to carry these," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I know," Keanu replied, "but I want to." They walked together up the short path leading to Harold's unit on the ground floor. The door was tucked behind a thin hedge, a faded doormat resting in front of it with the word "Welcome" barely visible anymore. Harold fumbled for his keys, hands still slightly shaky from the cold and the emotion of the night. Keanu waited patiently, holding the bags with ease, not rushing a thing. The door finally creaked open, revealing a small but tidy apartment. A bookshelf stood along one wall, stacked with old paperbacks and framed photos. A folded American flag sat in a case on the mantel, next to a black and white photo of a young soldier in uniform. Keanu stepped inside, just enough to set the bags on the kitchen counter. He didn't glance around much, respecting the space as if it were sacred. Harold closed the door behind them. "Would you like a cup of tea?" he asked suddenly. Keanu paused, caught off guard. "Sure, if you're offering." Harold moved slowly, placing his cane against a chair and reaching into a cupboard for two mismatched mugs. He filled the kettle with water, his back to Keanu, as he spoke. "You know, I haven't had company in a long while, not since my wife passed." Keanu stood quietly by the door, listening. "She used to make tea like clockwork, every evening, mint for her, black for me. Said it calmed her spirit." The kettle began to hum. Harold turned around. "She would have liked you." Keanu smiled gently. "I think I would have liked her too." They shared the tea in silence, steam rising slowly between them as the clock on the wall ticked. There were no cameras, no headlines, just two people, one giving, the other receiving. Both changed in ways they didn't fully understand yet. The rain had stopped, but something deeper had just begun. As they stepped back outside, the rain had picked up again. A steady sheet of water blanketed the sidewalk, and distant thunder rolled low across the Los Angeles sky. Harold pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders and looked toward the street. "I'll walk up a few blocks," he said, gesturing with his cane. "Catch the 720. It's a late one, but it'll get me close enough." Keanu blinked at him, surprised. "You took the bus here?" Harold nodded with a weak smile. "Can't drive anymore. My depth perception's not what it used to be, and the DMV didn't take kindly to that." Keanu looked at the soaked street, then back at Harold, his thin frame hunched slightly, his coat damp, and his cane unsteady on the wet ground. "Let me give you a ride," Keanu said, gently but firmly. "It's raining, and you've got groceries." No argument. Harold hesitated. "You've done enough already." Keanu reached for the grocery bags. "I've got time." Harold studied him for a long moment, then gave a small, reluctant nod. "All right, but just to the corner of Rosewood and Western. I don't want to be a burden." "You're not," Keanu said simply. They walked back to the car together, water puddling around their shoes, streetlights glowing against the sheen of rain. Keanu popped the trunk and placed the groceries inside, then opened the passenger door for Harold and helped him in again, making sure his coat wasn't caught in the door. Once inside, the car felt warm. The rain against the windshield added a soft rhythm as Keanu pulled away from the curb and merged onto the road. "I used to love nights like this," Harold said quietly. "When I was teaching, I'd stay up late grading papers while the rain hit the window. Something peaceful about it." Keanu glanced over at him. "What did you teach?" "History," Harold replied with a bit of pride. 34 years in the LA Unified School District. Started at Roosevelt High, ended at Garfield. Keanu nodded slowly. "That's a legacy." Harold shrugged. "Some days I wonder if it mattered. The world moves so fast now. The kids I taught, some are grandparents by now. Time's strange like that. Keanu didn't interrupt. He let Harold talk, eyes focused on the road, but ears fully open. I'd bring in old newspapers, vintage magazines, letters from World War II, Harold continued. Tried to make the past feel real. You know, give them more than just dates and battles. I wish I'd had a teacher like you, Keanu said. Harold chuckled. You're too kind. I was strict, had a reputation for it, but I cared deeply. They drove in silence for a moment more. The city stretched out before them, sleepy now, rain-slicked and dim, but still alive in its own way. Harold shifted in his seat as they passed under a flickering streetlight. Did I mention I served too? He said, almost as an afterthought. Vietnam, 67 to 71. 1st Infantry Division. Keanu looked over, his brow tightening slightly with respect. You did mention it. That's no small thing. Harold nodded slowly. I don't talk about it much. Not because I'm ashamed, just some things don't need retelling. The memories are enough. The windshield wipers clicked softly in rhythm, slicing through the rain. I lost a lot of friends over there, Harold added. But I also found myself, learned what it meant to stand for something, to protect others, even when no one would protect you. Keanu glanced over, humbled. I respect that more than you know. You know, Harold said, his voice growing warmer. You've got good manners. It's rare these days. Most folks your age wouldn't take time out of their night for an old man like me. Keanu smiled faintly. Maybe the world needs more people who do. They came to a stoplight, and Harold turned to look at him more closely. Do I know you? He asked, not accusingly, but curiously. You look awfully familiar. Keanu chuckled lightly. I get that sometimes. You in movies? Harold pressed. Yeah, Keanu admitted, eyes still on the light. You might have seen a few. Harold squinted, then laughed. Wait a minute, my grandson made me watch that one. What's it called? The one with the dog and the car chases? Keanu grinned. That narrows it down. Harold snapped his fingers. John Wick, that's the one. You're him, aren't you? Keanu nodded slightly, amused, guilty. Harold leaned back in his seat, genuinely surprised. Well, I'll be. My grandson swore up and down you were the coolest guy alive. Said you trained with Navy SEALs for that role. I trained with some amazing people, Keanu said modestly. But I'm just an actor, Harold chuckled. My grandson's gonna lose his mind when he hears I met you. And here I thought you were just another kind soul. Keanu looked over and said softly, Why not both? The rain began to let up as they turned onto a quiet residential street. Cracked sidewalks, leaning mailboxes, and overgrown hedges lined the neighborhood. A few porch lights flickered on as they passed, casting a golden glow over the puddles that dotted the pavement. This is me, Harold said, pointing. Right there, Unit 3B. Don't mind the porch light, it's been busted for years. Keanu pulled into the small gravel driveway and put the car in park. The house was small, its paint faded and chipping from years of sun and rain. A rusted wind chime hung by the door, barely moving in the damp air. Keanu stepped out, grabbed the grocery bags from the trunk, and walked them up the cracked path. Harold struggled with his keys for a second, then opened the weather-worn door with a click. Come in, if you don't mind. I've got a decent cup of coffee I can offer. It's not gourmet, but it'll warm the soul. Keanu gave a quiet nod and followed him inside. The living room was modest but tidy, with a worn recliner facing an old television set. Framed photos of students, soldiers, and family members lined the shelves. A folded American flag sat in a display case on a wooden side table, surrounded by medals and a faded black and white photo of a young Harold in uniform. Make yourself comfortable, Harold said, setting his cane aside and slowly making his way to the kitchen. I'll get the water boiling. Keanu stood for a moment, looking at the space. The air smelled faintly of old books, wood polish, and something warm like cinnamon and thyme. He placed the bags on the small counter near the entry and glanced at a photograph taped to the fridge. It showed a much younger Harold standing beside a group of kids holding a history fair sign. Everyone in the picture was smiling. From the kitchen, Harold called out, I used to brew coffee before every class. Thought it kept the kids from falling asleep while I talked about the Battle of Gettysburg. Keanu smiled. Did it work? Nope, Harold laughed. But it made me feel better. A few minutes later, Harold returned with 2 mugs. They were mismatched. One said "World's Okayest Teacher," and the other featured a faded American flag. He handed Keanu the second one. They sat quietly, sipping, the storm softening outside into a steady drizzle. I'll be honest, Harold said eventually, voice softer now. I wasn't expecting kindness tonight, especially not from a stranger. Keanu shook his head. You're not a stranger, Harold. You're a man who served his country, shaped young minds, and still stands tall. Harold blinked slowly, staring into his mug. That means more than you know. Outside, the wind calmed. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was full with memory, respect, and something unspoken forming between the 2 men. Keanu didn't need to say much. He didn't need to be a celebrity in that moment. Just present, just human. And as Harold leaned back with a sigh, his eyes growing a little misty, he said, It's been a long time since someone sat and listened. Keanu replied, Then let's not rush this. The warm coffee seemed to melt the chill that had followed them in from the rain. The room, though small and time-worn, had the feeling of a life well lived. On the mantel, Keanu noticed a photo of a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, smiling with her arms around Harold. They looked happy. Next to it sat a smaller frame with a picture of a younger Harold in military dress blues, flanked by soldiers with arms slung over each other's shoulders. Keanu's eyes lingered. That's Margaret, Harold said, his voice tinged with affection. My wife. She passed away 7 years ago. Cancer. Came fast. We didn't even get the chance to fight it. Keanu looked up, a flicker of sorrow passing through him. I'm sorry. Harold gave a small nod. She was my heart, my balance. I was the kind of guy who could get too caught up in books or papers. She kept me grounded. Even during my hardest years, when I came back from the war and couldn't sleep, when I'd wake up shaking, she was there. He turned slightly in his chair and gestured toward a cluster of photographs lining the top of a bookcase. Those are my students. Every class, every year, I'd take a photo on the last day. Some of them became teachers themselves. A few even came back to teach at the same high school. Keanu stood and slowly walked toward the bookcase. His eyes moved from frame to frame. So many faces, young people with bright smiles, silly poses, or arms raised in excitement. One image showed Harold wearing a toga, standing between students dressed as historical figures. You were more than a teacher, Keanu said, half smiling. You created memories. Harold gave a soft laugh. Yeah, well, I always said if history felt like a list of dates, I'd failed. I wanted them to feel the weight of decisions, the pain of injustice, the courage of those who resisted. I told them real heroes didn't wear capes. They voted, they marched, they taught, they healed, and they stood up when it counted. Keanu returned to his chair, still holding the coffee mug. He nodded slowly. That sounds like a man who showed up for the world. Harold took a long sip, then sat back with a quiet sigh. Maybe, or maybe I just got lucky. Teaching kept me from drowning in everything I saw in Vietnam. Every time I stepped into that classroom, I felt like I was doing something that mattered. Keanu looked over, his voice lower now. You were. The rain outside softened to a gentle whisper on the windows. Inside, the silence felt full. Keanu leaned forward slightly, both hands wrapped around the warm mug. His eyes stayed on Harold, studying the man's quiet strength, the weight behind every word he spoke. I taught for 41 years, Harold said. I missed only 3 days. One was when my father passed. The second was the day Margaret went into surgery. The third was the day I retired. Keanu raised an eyebrow. Just 3? Harold nodded. I figured if I asked those kids to show up, I better do the same. Besides, I loved it. Even when the school didn't have enough funding or we were teaching from textbooks older than the students, I still loved it. He paused, his eyes drifting to a faded certificate on the wall. Lifetime Educator Award, Harold Thompson. They gave me that at the district banquet, he continued. I remember thinking, well, that's it. My name on a plaque. That's all the world will remember. But then, 2 years ago, a former student tracked me down. She became a lawyer. Said my lesson on the civil rights movement made her want to defend the voiceless. Keanu felt something tighten in his chest. He knew that feeling of wondering if your work mattered. If your pain, your discipline, your sacrifice ever truly made a difference. Sometimes, Harold said quietly, I wonder if Margaret would be proud. She used to say I gave too much to everyone else and not enough to myself. Keanu's gaze dropped for a moment. The words hit deeper than he expected. I lost someone too, he finally said. Her name was Jennifer. We were going to have a child, but they didn't make it. Car accident. Years ago. Harold's face fell into a solemn stillness. I'm sorry, Keanu. That kind of loss, it never leaves, does it? No, Keanu replied softly. It just changes shape. Some days it's a whisper, other days it's a scream. They sat in silence again, two men from different generations, bonded by grief that neither had chosen. It was the kind of pain that shaped you without asking permission. After a moment, Harold said, You know what I miss most? Her voice, the way she'd hum while folding laundry. It wasn't even a real tune, just her way of filling the silence. Keanu looked toward the photo of Margaret again. Sounds like love lived in the little things. Harold smiled gently. It always does. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking the passage of time with a rhythm that somehow felt slower in Harold's living room. Keanu leaned back in his chair, letting the silence stretch. It wasn't awkward. It was respectful, sacred even, the kind of stillness that didn't need to be filled. Harold stood slowly, his cane tapping the floor as he walked to a cabinet beside the television. He opened the drawer and pulled out a small leather-bound journal, its edges worn and the spine cracked from years of use. He handed it to Keanu. I started this the day after I got back from Vietnam, he said. Margaret told me to write things down I couldn't say out loud. Keanu opened it carefully. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, and honest. There were entries about students who made him proud, moments when he felt lost, passages about Margaret's laughter, and a note about a dream he had of teaching their unborn child how to ride a bike, one that never came to be. She wanted children, Harold whispered. We tried, but it never happened for us. That's why I poured everything into the classroom. Those kids, they became ours in a way. Keanu nodded, his throat tight. I know that kind of ache. You know, Harold continued, when I watch young people now, faces glued to phones, rushing through life, it makes me wonder if anyone stops to feel anymore, to grieve, to hope, to sit with someone else's story. Keanu met his gaze. You just taught someone how. Harold chuckled under his breath. Still a teacher, huh? Always, Keanu said with a quiet smile. And I think the world needs more of them. Harold looked down at his hands. They were veined, weathered, marked by time and work. Sometimes I wonder how much longer I'll be around. The medicine helps, but the body, it's tired. I miss feeling needed. You are needed, Keanu said. Even this moment, sitting here, sharing your story, it matters. You reminded me that grief doesn't have to isolate us. It can connect us, heal us. The rain had stopped now. Outside, the night was silent and still. Harold reached over and gently patted Keanu's shoulder. You've got a good heart. Not many would have stopped to help a stubborn old man at the grocery store. Keanu smiled, softly. Maybe the universe wanted me to. And for the first time in a long time, Harold didn't feel invisible. Not as a veteran, not as a widower, not as a retired teacher. He felt seen. And Keanu Reeves, the man who had come in from the rain for bread and coffee, now found something he hadn't expected: a friend, and maybe a new kind of purpose. After they finished their coffee, Harold stood with a bit more energy than before. He tapped his cane once on the floor and looked over at Keanu. "Want to see something?" he asked, the corner of his mouth curling into a smile. Keanu stood. "Sure." Harold led him through the narrow hallway toward the back door. It opened onto a short concrete path, slick from the rain, leading to a detached garage that looked more like a time capsule than a workspace. Its wooden frame was faded from decades of sun and storms. Ivy had begun to crawl up the sides. Harold pushed the door open with his cane, using his shoulder for leverage. Inside, the smell of sawdust, old books, and aged wood filled the air. Fluorescent lights flickered to life overhead, casting a soft yellow glow over a surprisingly vibrant scene. The space wasn't just a garage, it was a world. There were old desks, folding chairs, history posters taped to the walls, and boxes filled with well-worn textbooks stacked neatly. Along one side, maps of the United States and the world were pinned like banners. A rotating globe sat beside a vintage chalkboard. There was even a small bookshelf filled with binders labeled by year. Keanu's eyes widened as he stepped in. "You taught here?" Harold chuckled. "Retired from the school, not from teaching. Kids in the neighborhood come by after school. Their parents are working, or they just need help. I do what I can." Keanu looked around with growing awe. "This is incredible." Harold moved slowly to the far wall, where a bulletin board spanned from one end of the garage to the other. It was completely covered in handwritten letters, thank you cards, and photos. Some were childlike, drawn in crayon with clumsy handwriting. Others were typed, formal, clearly written by adults. "This is what keeps me going," Harold said softly. Keanu stepped closer, drawn to the wall. He read the first letter. "Dear Mr. Thompson, I never understood history until you made it come alive. You didn't just teach me facts, you taught me how to ask questions. I became a teacher because of you." Another letter, from someone named Jordan L., read, "You probably don't remember me, but I remember you. I was the quiet one in the back who always wore a hoodie. You told me my ideas mattered. That changed everything. I'm now a city council member because you believed I had something to say." Keanu looked over his shoulder at Harold. "You kept all of these?" "Every single one," Harold said. "Some of these kids, they didn't have anyone else who believed in them. I wanted them to know I never stopped." Keanu turned back to the wall. He saw a photograph of a young woman in a graduation gown, holding a sign that said, "Thanks, Mr. T, made it to Harvard." There was no fame in this room. No cameras. No headlines. But Keanu had never seen anything more powerful. This wasn't just a garage. It was a monument to quiet greatness. Keanu stood in silence for a moment, taking in the weight of what surrounded him. This wasn't some nostalgic display. It was living proof of a man's quiet impact, one student at a time. He turned toward Harold, who had taken a seat on an old wooden stool. Rain tapped gently against the garage roof above them. "You built this yourself?" Keanu asked. Harold nodded. "Started right after I retired. I didn't know what to do with all the energy. So I cleaned out this old place and turned it into something useful." Keanu glanced at a corner shelf stacked with supplies, pencils, loose-leaf paper, flashcards, and flash drives, all carefully organized. "Do you get help keeping this going?" Harold shook his head. "Some parents donate a little, but most of it's out of my pension check. I make do." Keanu walked along the wall of letters again, reading another one from a young man named Eric. "Mr. Thompson, I was in foster care when you taught me. I'd already changed schools 6 times. You were the first person who saw something in me. I now work as a public defender in Oakland. Thank you for not giving up on a kid like me." The words sank into Keanu's chest like stones dropped in water. He felt the familiar ache, the kind he felt when remembering those he'd lost, those he couldn't help. "You've done more than most people I know," Keanu said, voice low. Harold let out a soft breath. "You know, people think change happens through big speeches or political movements. But sometimes it happens when you just sit across from a kid and tell them, 'I believe you can do better.' That's it. That's the whole trick." Keanu smiled faintly, feeling humbled. That's not a trick, Harold. That's a gift. There was a pause between them, comfortable and sincere. Harold pointed toward a small corkboard near the workbench. It was filled with photos not just of students, but of Harold himself standing beside them over the years. School plays, spelling bees, community fairs. In each one, he wore the same kind expression: calm, present, proud. I get tired, sure, Harold added. Some days I wonder if I'm too old to keep it up. But then a kid knocks on that door, asks for help with an essay or a history project, and suddenly, I'm 20 again. Keanu reached for one of the photographs. A teenage boy, clearly struggling with a stutter, stood beside Harold at a science fair holding a ribbon. The caption underneath read, "Never gave up. Thanks to Mr. T." Keanu didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Harold's legacy wasn't buried in a biography or engraved on a plaque. It was written in the hearts of people who had walked through that garage and left believing in themselves for the first time. Harold pushed himself up from the stool and walked toward a tall metal filing cabinet. Its surface was covered in decades-old magnets and faded stickers, each one a small story in itself. With some effort, he opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a folder thick with worn paper edges. "Some of my favorites," he said, handing it to Keanu. Keanu took the folder carefully. Inside were handwritten letters, drawings from students in crayon and marker, even a few essays printed on dot matrix paper. One drawing showed Harold as a superhero, flying over a classroom. Another was a thank you note in shaky cursive, stained by what looked like old tears. He read slowly. "Dear Mr. Thompson, when my dad passed, I stopped talking in class. You didn't push me. You just sat with me after school and let me be quiet until I was ready. No one's ever done that for me." Another said simply, "You taught me how to believe I mattered." Keanu swallowed hard. Harold looked over, then down at his hands. "You see why I couldn't just toss all this after retirement. It's not about pride. It's about remembering that I didn't waste my time on this earth." Keanu closed the folder and placed it gently back on the workbench. "You didn't waste a second." A heaviness filled the room, not sadness, but gravity. As if the air itself understood the weight of Harold's service, not just as a veteran, but as a mentor, a guide, a safe harbor for lost kids. And then, something shifted in Keanu's mind. A flicker of purpose. A voice, quiet but clear, telling him that this story wasn't supposed to end in a forgotten garage with rusty hinges and flickering light bulbs. "This needs to be seen," Keanu murmured. Harold glanced at him. "What do you mean?" "All of this, these letters, these photos, your work with the kids. The world needs to know what you've done, Harold. People need to be reminded that heroes don't always wear uniforms or win awards. Sometimes they just keep showing up." Harold smiled faintly, modest. "I've had my moment. I'm just glad I still have a purpose." But Keanu wasn't convinced. As he looked around the workshop once more, the peeling paint, the dim lighting, the quiet triumphs layered in every corner, he saw something more. This was a story waiting to be told. And he knew with a certainty that reached deep into his chest that he would be the one to tell it. Because men like Harold Thompson shouldn't fade into silence. They deserved to echo. A soft knock at the door startled Harold from his afternoon reading. It had been a quiet week, with the rain gone and the spring sun finally beginning to warm the edges of the small front porch. He shuffled to the door with his cane, expecting maybe a neighbor or a delivery. But when he opened it, Keanu stood there, holding a carefully wrapped package under one arm and a gentle smile. "You again," Harold said, his voice rising with a mixture of surprise and something close to joy. "Didn't think you'd remember an old man like me." "I told you I would," Keanu replied simply. "And I brought you something." Harold stepped aside to let him in, the same warmth settling over the living room as it had a week earlier. Keanu unwrapped the package slowly on the coffee table, revealing a hardbound edition of Narratives of American History, a rare 1,940 seconds print with leather binding and gold-trimmed edges. Harold stared at it, motionless. "I remember you said this was your favorite," Keanu explained. "Said you used to read it in the school library, but never had your own copy." Harold sat down, reaching for the book, with hands that trembled just a little. He ran his fingers over the cover like it was something sacred. "I haven't seen this in 50 years. My wife used to joke that I loved this book more than her." Keanu chuckled. "Well, now you have both the memory and the book." Harold grew quiet, his eyes misting over. "You didn't have to do this. I wanted to," Keanu said, sitting across from him. "It's not much, but sometimes it's the little things that matter." They talked for a while, slipping into the same easy rhythm they'd found before. Keanu didn't bring cameras, or fanfare, or even mention that he was famous. In this space, none of that mattered. What mattered was that Harold felt seen. Harold eventually stood and disappeared into the hallway, returning with a shoebox filled with more letters. He handed it to Keanu, who opened it gently, revealing dozens of folded notes, some yellow with age, others more recent. "These are from the ones who never forgot me," Harold said. "Some of them wrote after they graduated, some after they had kids of their own. I kept them all. I don't know why. It just felt like a kind of proof that I didn't disappear." Keanu read one aloud. "Dear Mr. Thompson, I became a teacher because of you. You believed in me when I was failing everything. Now I run a school that believes in every kid, just like you did." Keanu looked up, his voice thick. "That's not disappearing. That's impact." Keanu leaned back on the couch, the letter still in his hand, eyes scanning the others now visible in the box. Some were scribbled in childish handwriting, full of spelling mistakes and doodles. Others were typed on professional letterheads. The contrast was beautiful raw beginnings beside polished success. "Do you ever write back?" Keanu asked. Harold smiled. "Every time I could. I didn't always have the energy, especially these last few years. But I never wanted them to think I'd forgotten. They gave me more than they realize." Keanu nodded. "You gave them a reason to believe they mattered. That doesn't go away." The afternoon light poured through the window, falling across Harold's worn recliner and the faded rug beneath their feet. Keanu took a breath, thoughtful, and then asked, "Would you mind if I took a few of these with me, just to read? I'd bring them back." Harold hesitated for a second, then nodded slowly. "You can. Just treat them like they're living things." "I will," Keanu promised. They spent the next hour reading more together. One letter came from a woman named Dr. Clarice Monroe, now Dean of Education at a prestigious university in Boston. "She was impossible," Harold said, chuckling. "Always arguing, challenging every idea I taught, but that girl had fire. I told her once that if she ever stopped asking questions, the world would be worse off for it." Keanu smiled at that. Looks like she never stopped. Apparently not. Clarice's letter spoke of structural change, of how she fought to bring better resources to underfunded schools. She ended the letter with a sentence that struck deep. "Every time I stand up in front of a classroom or a board of directors, I imagine you sitting in the back of the room, making sure I never forget where I came from." Keanu folded the letter carefully and returned it to the box. "She should know you're still here." "Still shaping minds." Harold looked away, embarrassed. "I don't need credit. It's not about credit," Keanu said gently. "It's about legacy. You kept all their voices alive in this box. Maybe it's time the world heard yours again." Harold didn't respond immediately. He looked at the window, where the light now cast long shadows across the room. He seemed smaller in that moment, worn down by time, but not defeated. "Do you think anyone would care?" Keanu's voice was steady. "I care. And if I do, others will too." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was full of meaning, respect, connection. Two men from very different lives, sharing something that words couldn't fully explain. And in that stillness, something shifted. A new beginning formed. Later that evening, Keanu stood near the front door, preparing to leave. Harold handed him a small bundle of letters tied with string. "Those are the ones I never got around to answering," Harold said. "I figured if anyone could make sense of them, maybe it's you." Keanu took the bundle with care. "I will, and I'll make sure they're not forgotten." Harold smiled, then gestured toward the kitchen. "You didn't touch your second cup of coffee. "I was too busy being moved," Keanu said, and they both laughed softly. But before Keanu could open the door, Harold spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Do you think people like me, old teachers, forgotten veterans, do you think we still matter?" Keanu turned to face him fully, eyes sincere. "You're the reason the rest of us still believe in something worth fighting for." Harold's throat tightened. He didn't speak, just nodded and looked down, his hands gripping the edge of the doorway for support. Outside, the rain had stopped. The street glistened under the amber hue of the street lamps. The world felt strangely still, as if giving space for something sacred. Keanu stepped out into the night, but paused at the bottom of the porch steps. He turned back to Harold one last time. "I'll be back," he said simply. And he meant it. That night, Keanu didn't go straight home. He sat in his car, parked along a quiet road, flipping through the bundle of letters Harold had given him. Each was a testament to a life touched, a lesson remembered, a heart changed, not by fame, not by power, but by presence, consistency, kindness. He read one from a man who had been in juvenile detention at 16. Harold had taught night classes there, and his words had ignited a hunger in the boy that eventually led him to law school. Another letter came from a single mother who had been one of Harold's students during a difficult year. She wrote that his encouragement had kept her from dropping out. She now worked as a counselor for at-risk youth. Keanu's eyes welled with tears, not out of pity, but out of awe. Harold had never asked for recognition. He had simply kept showing up. The idea in Keanu's heart, which had been forming quietly over the past few days, now took sharper shape. This legacy couldn't stay boxed in a garage. This story, Harold's story, needed to be told. Not just as a tribute, but as a call to remember the everyday heroes walking among us, the ones whose names don't trend, but whose impact echoes through generations. Keanu started the car. He already knew where. He'd be going tomorrow. A week had passed since Keanu's return visit. The quiet friendship between him and Harold had settled into a rhythm: occasional check-ins, coffee on the porch, the exchange of letters from old students, and long conversations about life, education, and meaning. But beneath the peaceful surface, Keanu began to notice something that made his chest tighten with worry. It started subtly. Harold would lean on the doorframe a little longer than usual. His steps were slower. He brushed off small things, like forgetting where he left his glasses, or struggling to unscrew the cap from a bottle of water. When Keanu offered to help, Harold always waved him off with a half-joking comment about getting old. But the concern deepened when Keanu visited on a Tuesday afternoon. The rain had returned, light and misty. Harold was sitting in his favorite armchair, blanket draped over his lap, a book resting unopened on his chest. He didn't stir when Keanu knocked. The door had been left slightly ajar. Keanu stepped in gently, calling his name. Harold blinked awake. He smiled and tried to sit up straighter, but winced as he did. His hand went to his chest, not dramatically, but with a grimace that didn't escape Keanu's eye. "You all right?" Keanu asked, moving closer. Harold nodded. "Just a little tired. Didn't sleep well." Keanu noticed his breathing was shallow. His fingertips trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee. That's when Keanu saw the prescription bottles on the kitchen counter. 3 of them were full, unopened. He said nothing right away, but the unease in his stomach grew. A man like Harold, with his quiet pride and reluctance to burden others, was exactly the kind of person who would endure suffering in silence. Later that afternoon, Keanu made tea while Harold sat at the table. As the steam rose between them, Keanu finally asked the question that had been circling in his head. "I noticed your meds haven't been touched. Is everything okay with the prescription?" Harold hesitated, then offered a weak shrug. "They raised the price again. Thought I could stretch what I had left." Keanu's brow furrowed. "You're skipping heart medication? It's not as bad as it sounds," Harold said, forcing a smile. "Just buying time until next month's check." Keanu didn't smile back. His voice was soft, but steady. "Harold, no. That's not something you wait on. There was a long pause. Rain tapped gently on the windows. Harold looked down at his tea, then back up at Keanu. I'm not ready to be anyone's responsibility. You're not, Keanu said. But you matter to me. That's not charity, that's care. Harold didn't respond right away. His eyes, once so sharp when recalling historical details or student names, now held a kind of distant pain, like someone who'd grown used to being overlooked. He stirred his tea quietly, then set the spoon down with a soft clink. I used to tell my students, he said slowly, that dignity is doing the right thing, even when no one's watching. But it's funny how, when you get older, pride and dignity start getting tangled up. Keanu leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice calm. Then maybe dignity is also letting someone care when it matters. Not pushing everyone away just because you don't want to seem weak. Harold looked up, and for a moment, there was something raw in his expression, grief, perhaps, or the fatigue of holding himself together for too long. I lost the rhythm of living after my wife passed, Harold admitted. You start cutting corners, pretending it's fine. At first, it's small things. Then one day, you're rationing heart pills like they're candy. Keanu reached across the table, not dramatically, but with quiet steadiness. He placed his hand over Harold's. The room fell still, the kind of stillness that only happens when the truth is finally spoken. I'm taking you to the doctor tomorrow, Keanu said firmly. Harold tried to protest, but the strength behind Keanu's eyes silenced him. That next morning, Keanu showed up early. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening. He brought coffee and an extra umbrella, even though the sun peeked through low clouds. Harold stepped out slowly, leaning heavily on his cane. Keanu opened the car door for him without a word. The ride to the clinic was quiet at first. Harold stared out the window, watching the familiar neighborhoods roll past. He broke the silence after a few blocks. I used to walk these streets every weekend with my wife, he said. She'd stop at every flower shop and bakery, as if we had nowhere else to be. I miss that. I miss her. Keanu nodded softly. I know what that's like. Harold glanced over. You lost someone too? Keanu didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. His silence was full of meaning. The world knew the stories his partner, his child, years ago. But Harold could tell this was different. This was a moment between two men who understood the quiet ache of moving forward with pieces missing. The doctor's visit took longer than expected. Blood pressure, EKG, medication reviews. Keanu sat in the waiting room while Harold underwent tests. The nurse at the front desk did a double take when she recognized him, but he only smiled and gently asked her not to make a fuss. She nodded, touched by his kindness. When Harold finally emerged, he looked a little embarrassed but relieved. Doc says, I need to start being more consistent, he muttered, and that I'm lucky I came in when I did. Keanu gave a half smile. Then we'll keep being lucky, one checkup at a time. Back in the car, Harold stared at the new prescription bag resting on his lap. I hate feeling like I'm slipping, he admitted. This body used to be strong. This heart used to run for miles. Now, I get winded tying my propers. Shoes. Keanu kept his eyes on the road, but spoke with quiet clarity. You're not slipping, Harold. You're surviving. And surviving still matters. That sentence hung in the air like a prayer. They stopped at a small diner on the way back, one Harold used to visit with his wife. The booths were cracked, the coffee lukewarm, but the waitress remembered his name. As they sat across from each other sipping coffee, Harold's hands trembled slightly, but he didn't try to hide them. I don't want to be pitied, he said. You're not, Keanu replied. You're seen. That was the moment Harold exhaled, really exhaled. As if finally letting go of the fear that had been weighing on him since the first missed dose, the first skipped meal, the first night he couldn't sleep because his chest ached and his money had run out. He wasn't alone anymore. Harold sat at his small kitchen table, sorting through envelopes of old student letters with weathered hands. The morning light filtered through the window, soft and golden, casting a glow over the curled edges of paper filled with youthful handwriting. Some of the notes were decades old, yet the gratitude they held felt fresh. Keanu sat across from him, a mug of black coffee between his hands, quietly watching. He had come by early again. No cameras, no noise, no entourage, just himself, as usual. Harold looked up and smiled faintly. You know, I used to think these letters were all I had left. Now, I'm not so sure. Keanu leaned forward, elbows resting on the table. What if I told you those letters could become the beginning of something bigger? Harold raised an eyebrow, cautious. Bigger? Keanu nodded. Your students remember you because you didn't just teach facts. You taught them how to think, how to question, how to believe in themselves. What if there was a way to pass that down to teachers who are out there right now, struggling in underfunded classrooms, looking for a spark? Harold set the letter down slowly. That's a flattering thought, Keanu. But I'm just one man. I was lucky. Right place, right time. No, Keanu said gently. You made the place right. You made the time count. That's the difference. There was a pause as Harold considered that. The wind moved softly through the trees outside. A bird chirped once and flew off. Keanu continued, his voice steady but filled with something deeper. I've seen a lot of projects come and go, fundraisers, initiatives, but most of them lack heart. They're corporate, impersonal. But this could be built on real connection, real stories, real legacy. Harold looked uncomfortable now, even skeptical. Legacy? I'm not looking for my name on some building, Keanu. I don't want pity or attention. I've lived a good life, quietly. I don't need the spotlight. Keanu shook his head. This isn't about spotlight. And it's not about pity. It's about purpose. Your purpose doesn't have to end here. I'm not talking about fame. I'm talking about passing on a flame. Harold's eyes dropped to the stack of letters again. He picked one up from a student named Cameron who had once struggled with reading comprehension but now worked as a youth librarian. Cameron had written, "You made me believe I wasn't dumb. You gave me my first real victory." You see that? Keanu said quietly, nodding at the letter in Harold's hands. That's not just a thank you. That's proof of something powerful. And that power shouldn't die with a box of letters in your garage. Harold sat still for a while, his face unreadable. Then he spoke, slowly. What do you have in mind? Keanu smiled, not the charming actor's smile, but something earnest and full of conviction. We create something together. A mentorship program for teachers. Something simple. Online, to start. We take your philosophy, your real methods, your approach, and share them. Not in a fancy academic way, just honest, practical guidance. Videos, stories. A place for teachers to be reminded of why they started. Harold didn't respond right away, but something in his shoulders shifted. The resistance softened. The room, filled with years of quiet, now held the quiet hum of possibility. Harold leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing as he weighed the idea. Keanu, you really think people would listen to an old man ramble about lesson plans and history projects from the 80 seconds? I don't think it, Keanu said. I know it, because the world is starving for teachers who care. You cared, and you changed lives. That kind of wisdom is rare and it needs to be heard. Harold chuckled under his breath. You're a persuasive guy, you know that? I've had practice, Keanu smiled, but I'm not trying to sell you something. I'm trying to honor what you've already built. Harold stared into his mug, which had long gone cold. You know, when my wife died, I felt like everything I'd done started to fade, like the meaning slipped away without her to see it. She was the one who always pushed me to write a book or speak at conferences. I always said no. I liked my corner of the world. And she was right, Keanu said. You do have something worth sharing. What if we did it in a way that kept your voice authentic? No lectures, no cameras in your face, Just conversations, essays, memories. We could write it together. Harold's eyes lifted. Together? Yes. I'll help you capture your stories. I'll find the right people to help shape the material into something teachers and students can access. You won't be alone. And you'll have full control. Harold's hand drifted toward one of the student letters again. He held it for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'd want it to feel personal, not like a program. Like a legacy made of people, not pages. Keanu smiled warmly. Exactly. Maybe we don't even call it a mentorship program. Maybe it's a living archive, a growing space where people contribute, learn, and honor those who taught them. Harold was quiet. His fingers tapped the table absently. You really believe in this? I do, Keanu said. Because I've met so many people who were never seen, never heard, never thanked. What if this becomes a place where every teacher sees their reflection, where they feel they matter again? Harold's eyes shimmered slightly. I spent decades trying to make kids feel seen, and lately, I've felt invisible. Keanu nodded slowly. You're not. Not to them. Not to me. That broke something loose. Harold exhaled sharply, as if letting go of a weight he'd carried for years. All right, he said, voice low. Let's try it. I can't promise it'll be any good, but if we do it quietly, and for the right reasons, I'll give it a shot. Keanu reached across the table, gently resting a hand on Harold's shoulder. That's all I needed to hear. The room felt different after that. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It felt full of intention. The morning light hit the box of letters like a quiet spotlight, illuminating the past and the beginning of something entirely new. Keanu sat alone in his study the next morning, the sun barely peeking through the window blinds. A manila folder lay on the table, filled with scanned letters Harold had shared with him, handwritten notes, typed pages, drawings from children long grown. These weren't just thank you notes. They were pieces of a legacy, and Keanu knew it was time to bring that legacy to life. He opened his laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard before he began typing names from the letters, first names, last names, school years, and whatever details Harold had scribbled in the margins. He created a spreadsheet and added notes beside each, where they might be, what they had become. Some names were familiar. He'd seen one on a local ballot years ago. Another rang a bell from a TED Talk he watched. The ripple was wider than either of them had realized. He sent out the first batch of messages through LinkedIn, alumni directories, and professional contacts. His note was short and sincere. Hi, I'm reaching out about a man named Harold Thompson. If you were one of his students, I'd love to speak with you about something meaningful. It didn't take long. The next morning, replies started pouring in. One read, "Oh my God, Mr. Thompson. I still have my 10th grade essay he marked up in red ink. Please tell me he's okay." Another, "That man taught me more about courage than any adult in my life. I owe him everything." One woman wrote, "He came to my house when I missed school for weeks after my mom died. Sat in our living room and read history out loud like it was a bedtime story. I'm a college professor now, because of him." Keanu read each message carefully, printing some out, saving others in a folder titled Legacy. His heart swelled. These were not generic compliments. They were tributes soaked in emotion and memory. He scheduled video calls with as many former students as he could. One by one, they appeared on screen, some in suits, others in scrubs, a few in music studios or offices. They all had different stories, but the same glimmer in their eyes when they spoke of Harold. "Mr. Thompson gave me detention once," said a man with salt and pepper hair and a firm voice. "But instead of making me sit in silence, he made me write a 2-page essay about personal responsibility. I've never forgotten that. I'm a judge now. I use that lesson in my courtroom." Another, a soft-spoken woman with a violin on the wall behind her, said, "He let me do my history project through music. No teacher had ever let me express myself that way. He planted the seed that became my life's work." Some of the calls ended in tears. Many ended in laughter. But all ended in commitment. When Keanu explained the idea for a foundation built around Harold's philosophy, one that would support struggling teachers, mentor at-risk students, and preserve Harold's legacy, the response was unanimous. "Count me in. I'll donate, I'll write, I'll volunteer. You tell me what Mr. Thompson needs, and I'm there." One former student, now a successful attorney in Washington, even offered to handle the legal setup for the foundation pro bono. Another had ties to an educational nonprofit that pledged matching funds. A retired tech executive who'd once been Harold's student said, "I'll cover the first year's operating budget." Keanu sat back in awe. This wasn't just a project anymore. It was becoming a movement. With the foundation now officially forming, Keanu carefully drafted the mission statement to honor the enduring legacy of Harold Thompson by empowering teachers, mentoring youth, and creating ripple effects of learning across underserved communities. He read it aloud, imagining Harold's reaction not prideful, but modest and deeply moved. One evening, Keanu pulled up to Harold's house, this time with a different energy in his chest. The sky was just beginning to darken, the air crisp with the scent of early autumn leaves. He carried a sealed envelope in one hand and a binder in the other. But he didn't go in right away. He paused on the porch, steadying his breath, knowing what this moment could mean. Harold opened the door slowly, leaning on his cane but smiling wide. His cheeks flushed when he saw Keanu. "You're becoming quite the regular," Harold chuckled. "I was just about to make some tea." Keanu stepped in, heart beating faster than it had on any film set. "I won't take long," he said, handing Harold the envelope first. Inside was a letterhead printed with the name, the Harold Thompson Educational Foundation. Below it, a list of donors, dozens of names, all former students. Some had written small notes next to their donations. "For the man who taught me to believe, to the one teacher who saw me, in honor of Mr. Place. Thompson." Harold sat down slowly, fingers trembling slightly as he held the paper. "What is this?" he asked, voice cracking. Keanu handed him the binder next. "This is your legacy. I've spoken with your former students. They're everywhere. Judges, doctors, musicians, scientists. You didn't just teach history, Harold. You made history." Harold was silent for a long moment. His eyes filled, but he wiped them quickly, pretending it was just dust in the air. He stared at the names, the notes, the logo bearing his name. "I never wanted recognition," he said softly. Keanu nodded. "And that's exactly why you deserve it." They sat together, in quiet for a few moments, the only sound the gentle clink of Harold's spoon stirring his tea. "I don't know what to say," Harold whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Keanu replied. "You already did through every lesson, every story, every act of kindness. This is just the world finally answering back." Harold reached for the binder again, flipping through the printed testimonials. One was from a woman who had grown up in foster care. She wrote how Harold stayed after school with her every Thursday, helping her believe she wasn't invisible. Another from a man who'd been incarcerated as a teen. Harold had written him a letter of recommendation when no one else would. He now led a nonprofit helping young men re-enter society. Keanu leaned forward, eyes steady. "This isn't just about you, Harold. It's about what you made possible in other people. We're launching the foundation next month. I'd like you to be there." Harold blinked slowly, as if trying to wake from a dream. "You're serious?" "I'm serious. And I'm not doing it alone. Your students are planning something special, something you'll never forget." A flicker of disbelief crossed Harold's face, followed by a quiet smile. "You've gone and done something extraordinary, Keanu." Keanu reached across the table, placing a hand gently on Harold's. "No, Harold, you did. I just helped the world finally notice." The sun had just started its descent when Keanu gently helped Harold into the car. The older man asked a few questions, curious but not suspicious. Keanu had kept the details vague, saying only that some people wanted to see him and that it wasn't a doctor's appointment. Harold, wearing his best blazer though a little loose from recent weight loss, clutched his cane with one hand and a leather-bound notebook in the other. They drove in comfortable silence through the quiet neighborhoods of the city. As they approached the high school, Harold raised an eyebrow. "This place looks different than I remember," he muttered, eyeing the freshly painted facade and modern glass front. "It got a little makeover," Keanu said with a gentle smile. "Let's go in." The moment Harold stepped into the renovated building, something shifted. The entryway smelled faintly of fresh wood and lemon polish, and the halls, once scuffed and dim, gleamed under new lights. Murals lined the walls, colorful depictions of history, community, and learning. Harold's eyes scanned every inch, as if trying to confirm whether this was truly the same school he had once taught in. As they reached the doors of the newly built library, Keanu gently took Harold's arm. "Wait here a second." Harold, puzzled, nodded. Keanu opened the double doors and guided him forward. Inside, the lights flickered on, revealing a room filled wall to wall with people. Some were seated, others stood waiting. There were teenagers in school uniforms, men and women in suits, elders with walkers, parents holding toddlers, and on each of their faces was the same expression, one of reverence. A banner stretched across the top of the room. "Welcome to the Thompson Learning Center." Harold stopped in his tracks. At first, his brain couldn't quite catch up to his eyes. He blinked rapidly, gripping his cane tighter as the emotion started to swell. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He took a slow step forward, then another, scanning the room as it erupted into applause. The sound rose like a wave applause, cheers, whistles, and the rhythmic clapping of generations of students and families whose lives he had touched. Some people had tears in their eyes. Others held handmade signs that read, "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," or "You changed my life." Harold turned to Keanu, stunned. What is this?" Keanu smiled softly. "This is for you." Two students approached from the front of the crowd. A girl named Vanessa, now a sophomore who had struggled with dyslexia until Harold began tutoring her after school, handed him a small bouquet of white lilies. Beside her, a tall man in his 40s, Michael Tran, now a pediatric surgeon, stepped up to the microphone. "I wouldn't be where I am today without this man," Michael said, voice strong but trembling. "When I didn't speak English, when I got bullied, when no one thought I'd make it, Mr. Thompson did. He saw something in me I didn't see in myself." Harold stood frozen, one hand over his heart. More voices followed. A woman named Lisa, now the director of a local museum, recalled how Harold had once brought her an old globe when her family couldn't afford books at home. A teacher at a nearby school shared how Harold mentored her through her certification exams after she failed twice. A councilman who had recently been elected stood up and said, "The first speech I ever wrote was in Mr. Thompson's class." Every story added another thread to the tapestry unfolding in Harold's mind. The laughter, the tears, the quiet gasps of disbelief from the crowd were like echoes from a life he thought had slipped quietly into the shadows. Harold's legs trembled beneath him, not from weakness this time, but from sheer emotional weight. Keanu moved closer and gently guided him to a chair near the front as the applause faded into a warm hush. A large framed plaque was unveiled, placed near the entrance of the library, etched in brass, "The Thompson Learning Center," dedicated to a man whose quiet commitment to education transformed lives, one heart at a time. Harold stared at it, his lips quivering. He whispered, "I don't deserve this." Keanu knelt beside him. "You do. You always did. You just never asked to be seen." Harold slowly turned to look at the room again, now filled with people he hadn't seen in decades. Familiar faces, now aged or grown. Some had gray hair. Others were only recognizable by the warmth in their eyes. One by one, they came forward, students, colleagues, parents, each pressing Harold's hand or giving him a tearful hug. A woman approached with a young boy at her side. "This is my son," she said softly. "He'll learn in a center that bears your name. I wanted him to meet the reason I finished school." Harold's eyes brimmed. He placed a wrinkled hand on the boy's shoulder. "You make your mother proud, okay? That's how you honor a legacy." The boy nodded solemnly, clearly moved by the moment, though barely old enough to understand its depth. At the back of the room, the school principal stepped up to the podium. This center will be used not just as a library, but as a mentoring space, a storytelling room, and a place where older students help younger ones, just like Mr. Thompson always did. Gasps and claps rippled again through the crowd. Another surprise followed. One by one, several of Harold's former students came forward holding sealed envelopes. Inside each was a pledge, a donation, a time commitment, or a promise to tutor a student in need. A mosaic of handwritten pledges lined the back wall. Together they formed the phrase, "You taught us, now we teach the world." Harold turned to Keanu again. "You did all this?" Keanu shook his head. "They did this. I just helped them remember." For a long moment, Harold said nothing. His throat tightened. The library, now alive with laughter and whispers, seemed to dissolve into blurred light through his watery eyes. He thought of his late wife. How she would have loved this. She had always told him he mattered more than he believed. And now, with her gone, the world was echoing her words back at him. "I thought I was invisible," Harold finally whispered. "You were never invisible," Keanu replied. "You were the light behind 1,000 lamps, and now the world gets to see who lit them." A final wave of applause swelled louder, fuller, more grateful than any standing ovation Harold had ever received. He didn't stand this time. He didn't have to. The legacy was standing for him. It started quietly at first, a few snarky comments buried in the corners of social media. A sarcastic tweet here, a cynical remark there. But within days of the Thompson Learning Center's unveiling, the narrative shifted. Headlines began to appear on gossip sites and entertainment blogs. Keanu's new role, Savior Complex, or PR Stunt. Hollywood's hero, or attention seeker. Is Keanu using a retired teacher to stay relevant? Keanu saw them one morning while sipping coffee in his kitchen. The glow of his phone screen lit up with article after article, many of them filled with speculation and accusation. Some implied Harold was being used. Others mocked the emotion of the event, calling it Oscar-worthy sentimentality. One even called the entire gesture a billionaire's pity parade. He set his phone down and stared at the countertop, the weight settling into his shoulders. He had been in the public eye for decades. He was used to criticism, but this felt different. This wasn't about a movie or a role. This was about something real, something pure. And now it was being questioned. He didn't mention it to anyone at first, trying to brush it off. But the whispers followed him. At the gym, someone asked if the foundation was tax-deductible. At lunch, a producer joked that it would make a great award season documentary. Even his publicist called and suggested releasing a formal statement to clarify his motives. That night, he drove back to Harold's house. He hadn't planned to. He just needed clarity, peace, something true. When he arrived, Harold was in his garage, surrounded by student essays, sorting through folders like nothing had changed. Keanu stepped inside and paused at the doorway. Harold looked up and saw the shadow on his face. "You look like someone just handed you bad news on your birthday," Harold said, placing a paper down. Keanu let out a short breath. "You've seen the headlines?" Harold nodded, calm as ever. "I have." I also saw the smile on Elena's face when she said her son wants to be a teacher now. That matters more. Keanu sat down on an old wooden bench beside a stack of dusty yearbooks. "I knew the world would talk. I just didn't think they'd talk like this." "They don't know you," Harold replied. "They know a version. A shadow on a screen. You gave something real, Keanu. Most people wouldn't understand what to do with real." Keanu looked over at him, eyes heavier than usual. "I didn't want this to become about me, but somehow it did." Harold smiled faintly. It always does when someone with a spotlight tries to lift someone in the dark. People can't help but question the motive. That doesn't mean the light was any less sincere. A silence passed between them, honest, gentle. Harold reached into a drawer and pulled out a small clipping. It was from a local paper, dated decades ago. The headline read, "Local teacher's unique method turns around failing class." He handed it to Keanu. This was the first time they wrote about me. Half the town loved it. The other half said I was a clown playing school instead of teaching. Keanu read it. What did you do? I kept teaching. Because truth always outlasts noise. Those words hung in the air. Solid. Final. Keanu sat back. Something in his chest eased. Not because the criticism was gone, but because Harold saw him. Not the actor, not the name. Just the man trying to do something good. The next morning, Keanu woke up with a different kind of resolve. Not the kind that came from anger or pride, but from clarity. He wouldn't issue a statement. He wouldn't defend himself on talk shows. And he wouldn't apologize for doing the right thing just because others misunderstood it. Instead, he picked up the phone and called Harold. Do you want to come with me? Keanu asked. To where? You'll see. Later that afternoon, they arrived at a small neighborhood school on the edge of town. It was run down, but filled with energy. Students poured through the halls, backpacks swinging, laughter echoing off cracked linoleum floors. The principal greeted them with wide eyes and grateful hands. They were there to visit a young history teacher named Adam, one of Harold's former students. Adam had written a letter to the foundation, asking for mentorship, support, and books for his underfunded classroom. When he saw Harold step inside, Adam froze. Then tears welled up in his eyes. You changed my life, he said softly. I teach because of you. Harold, visibly moved, reached for the younger man's shoulder. I taught you facts. You taught yourself how to turn them into fire. They spent the next 2 hours walking through the school. Keanu spoke little, letting Harold lead. He watched as students surrounded the old teacher like a returning legend. He watched as Harold's face lit up with every name he remembered, every memory triggered by the classroom walls. That evening, back at Harold's house, they sat quietly in the garage again. Today was better than any award I've ever won, Keanu said. Harold chuckled. Because it wasn't about you. Exactly. Harold leaned back in his chair, fingers resting gently on the edge of an old globe. You're doing something most people don't even attempt. You're turning admiration into action. And action will always attract criticism. I just didn't expect the world to twist something good into something shallow. They're not twisting it. They're testing it, Harold said. And if it holds, it becomes something real. That's the burden of doing something that matters. Keanu looked down at the floor. It's hard not to let it get to you. I know, but you've got something most people don't. What's that? A reason to keep going. Those words echoed long after the conversation ended. In the days that followed, Keanu kept quiet online. No interviews, no comments. Just more quiet visits to schools. More letters sent to former students. More planning with the foundation team behind the scenes. The media coverage slowly faded, replaced by new scandals, new gossip. The noise moved on, as it always did. But the work remained, and so did the bond between the two men. One night, as Keanu was leaving Harold's house, he paused at the front door. You know, I think this might be the first time in my life I feel like I'm doing something that doesn't need applause. Harold smiled from his armchair. Good. That means you're finally teaching. The evening started like so many others had in recent weeks. Harold's garage lights glowed softly against the deepening dusk, casting warm halos around boxes of books, an old chalkboard, and the long wooden table where a few local kids now gathered regularly for tutoring. Keanu had offered to host the sessions at a studio or even rent a space, but Harold refused. This garage, cluttered as it was, held history, his history. A boy named Diego was struggling to understand the difference between the Reconstruction era and the Civil Rights Movement. Another girl, Tasha, was building a model of the Lincoln Memorial for a school project. Harold moved between them with gentle patience, his voice steady, his words deliberate. But Keanu, who sat quietly in the corner with a cup of tea, noticed the change first. Harold paused mid-sentence. His left hand trembled as it reached for a marker. His breathing shifted less fluid, more strained. The children didn't see it, focused on their assignments, but Keanu was already standing. Harold placed a hand against the table, trying to catch his balance. A second later, He collapsed onto the floor. The crash of his chair startled everyone. Keanu rushed over, dropping to his knees beside him. "Harold, can you hear me?" Harold's eyes fluttered open for a second, then closed again. His chest heaved with shallow gasps. Keanu's hands moved automatically, checking his pulse, cradling his head, calling for help. One of the kids had already dialed 911. In the ambulance, Keanu sat beside Harold, gripping his hand tightly. The sirens wailed, bouncing between traffic lanes. Keanu said nothing. But inside, a storm was brewing. Panic, guilt, fear. All the quiet hours they had shared. All the stories. All the plans. None of it mattered if Harold didn't survive the night. At the hospital, they wheeled Harold through swinging emergency room doors. Keanu stayed close, answering intake questions, repeating medications, listing symptoms. When the doctor asked about his insurance, Keanu's jaw tensed. Harold had Medicare, barely enough. He'd skipped heart medications before to save money, Keanu remembered. And now it had caught up with him. Hours passed. Keanu paced the waiting room with clenched fists, ignoring the curious stares from a few patients who recognized him. Finally, a doctor emerged, clipboard in hand and exhaustion in his eyes. "He had a mild heart attack," the doctor said. "His heart's weaker than we expected. We'll need to do a catheterization to clear some blockages and possibly insert a stent, but his insurance only covers a portion. We'll need authorization for the rest." "You have it," Keanu said immediately. "We'll need a payment guarantee in writing. Send it to me, tonight." The doctor nodded, surprised but not asking questions. Keanu turned back toward the hospital room. Inside, Harold lay unconscious, hooked to monitors, oxygen mask pressed to his face. Tubes ran from his arms. Machines beeped softly, steadily. The man who had once stood in front of crowded classrooms with nothing but chalk and courage now looked small beneath fluorescent lights. Keanu walked to the side of the bed and sat down. "You're not done yet," he whispered. "You hear me? You're not finished." Harold didn't respond. Keanu stayed there through the night. Morning sunlight crept through the hospital blinds as Keanu sat motionless in the same chair, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of Harold's chest. The night had been long, filled with the quiet hum of machines and the occasional nurse checking vitals. Keanu hadn't slept. He couldn't. At one point, he'd pulled out his phone not to scroll, not to escape, but to look again at the old photo Harold had shown him just days earlier. A younger Harold, surrounded by wide-eyed students. A simple black and white image, but it carried weight, meaning, legacy. Now, that legacy lay hooked up to monitors. A nurse entered quietly and whispered, "He's stable. He'll be moved to a private room this afternoon." Keanu nodded. "Thank you." When Harold finally stirred, his first words came slowly, barely audible beneath the oxygen mask. "I ruined tutoring night, didn't I?" Keanu laughed softly and leaned in. "You scared the hell out of me. But no, the kids are fine. They were worried about you." Harold's hand moved slightly toward Keanu's. "They need someone steady. I can't be breaking down on them." "You're human, Harold," Keanu said. "Even heroes need rest." Harold's eyes welled with emotion, but he blinked it away. "I can't afford this, Keanu. Whatever they're doing, it's taken care of," Keanu interrupted gently. Harold looked up, puzzled. "I handled it," Keanu added. "You just focus on healing." There was a pause, a long one. Then Harold whispered, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Keanu said, squeezing his hand. "But I wanted to." The air between them grew thick, with quiet understanding. It wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was loyalty, friendship, family. Later that afternoon, when Harold was transferred to a private room, Keanu stayed with him, reading aloud letters from old students. It was something Harold had planned to do during their next tutoring session. He had gathered a stack, each one handwritten, decades old, folded with care. Keanu picked one at random and began. "Dear Mr. Thompson, I didn't know it then, but the day you pulled me aside and told me I had potential changed everything." As he read, Harold's eyes stayed fixed on the ceiling, blinking slow tears. The next letter was from a woman now running a nonprofit for at-risk teens. Another was from a former dropout who had become a pediatrician. Each story pointed back to Harold's quiet influence, his belief in students no one else believed in. Keanu paused, then looked up. "Your impact reaches far beyond this hospital room," he said. "It's time the world knew." Harold gave a tired but sincere smile. "You're not going to let me fade into the shadows, are you?" "Not a chance." There was silence for a few beats. Not uncomfortable, just full. Then Harold added softly, "I've taught thousands of students, but somehow, you've become my lesson." Keanu blinked back emotion. "What kind of lesson?" "That sometimes, the greatest gift a teacher can receive is knowing he was seen." Keanu reached for his friend's hand again. "You were always seen, Harold. Maybe now, finally, the world's just catching up." The machines kept beeping steadily as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Harold closed his eyes and rested. Keanu remained by his side, silently making a promise he intended to keep. The days following Harold's collapse were filled with uncertainty, but something unexpected began to stir outside the hospital walls. It started with one student, now a graphic designer in Seattle, who posted a heartfelt story on social media. The post included an old yearbook photo of Harold standing at the chalkboard, sleeve rolled up, pointing at a math problem with his signature passion. The caption read, "Mr. Thompson didn't just teach equations, he taught me how to believe in myself. I wouldn't be here without him. He's in the hospital now, and I think it's time the world knows who he island." Within hours, the post had thousands of shares. By evening, former students across the country joined in, flooding social media with tributes. One man shared how Harold had given him a winter coat when he couldn't afford one. A woman wrote about how Harold had helped her prepare for her college entrance exam when no one else believed she could make it. Another said Harold stayed after school for weeks to tutor her in chemistry when her parents were going through a divorce and she couldn't concentrate. Each story painted a mosaic of kindness, patience, and relentless belief in students who needed someone to believe in them. Then came the fundraiser. A group of former students, now lawyers, tech workers, small business owners, launched a crowdfunding page titled "Honor Mr. Thompson's Legacy." The goal was simple: raise enough money to help Harold fully recover and expand the educational foundation Keanu had helped create. But something happened no one expected. The goal was $50,000. In 24 hours, they passed $250,000. And it didn't stop there. News outlets picked up the story. Headlines read, "Hollywood star and beloved teacher spark national movement for education reform." Morning shows invited some of Harold's students to speak live. Clips of Keanu walking beside Harold in the hospital courtyard surfaced, and suddenly the internet had a new hero. But it wasn't just Keanu, it was Harold. People began commenting from all walks of life. "I never met this man, but we need more teachers like him. This brought me to tears. I had a teacher like Mr. Thompson. We need to protect them." I donated. Not because of Keanu, but because of the difference this teacher made. The Harold Thompson Educational Foundation website crashed twice in a single day from the influx of traffic. Within a week, the fund passed $1 million. School administrators from Oregon to Georgia started sending inquiries. They wanted to adopt Harold's mentorship model. They wanted to know how to train their staff the way Harold did. Keanu, who had remained largely in the background throughout the media storm, finally sat down with the board and said, "We're not just building a foundation anymore. We're building a movement." Meanwhile, Harold remained in his hospital bed, slowly recovering. The doctors said it would take time, but his body was responding well. One morning, a nurse walked in holding a small stack of printouts. "These are for you," she said, smiling. Harold looked confused. "More test results?" She chuckled. "No, messages, thousands of them. The staff's been printing out a few each day from the donation page and social media. We thought you might want to read them." She placed them on his tray table, and Harold stared in disbelief. The top message read, "You changed my father's life, and because of that, you changed mine." Harold's hands trembled as he picked up the papers. One by one, he read through them thank yous from parents, teachers, even students he never taught. People who had simply heard the story and were moved to act. His chest rose with emotion. This wasn't just charity. This wasn't pity. This was love. Real, earned, unforgettable love. Harold leaned back against his pillows, eyes moist, a trembling hand resting on the stack of messages. For a moment, he couldn't speak. The weight of it all pressed against his chest, not with pain, but with something deeper: gratitude, recognition, belonging. He looked out the hospital window, where the sun was setting behind the city skyline, casting golden hues across the floor. For most of his life, Harold had taught behind closed doors. No cameras, no applause, just chalk on a board and tired students staring back. He had never expected anyone to remember. He never wanted attention, just to make a difference, one child at a time. Now he was watching that quiet mission ripple outward in waves he couldn't have imagined. Later that evening, Keanu arrived, carrying 2 milkshakes from a local diner. "I heard from the nurse you were craving chocolate," he said with a warm grin. Harold chuckled softly. "She's a traitor." Keanu pulled a chair close and handed one over. "You've broken the internet, you know." Harold raised an eyebrow. "I don't even own a computer." Keanu laughed. "Doesn't matter. You're a legend now. People are donating from countries we can't even pronounce. And schools, everywhere, want to replicate your mentorship system. This thing, it's gotten huge." Harold shook his head, still in awe. "Why now, Keanu? Why me?" Keanu paused, then leaned forward. "Because you matter. And for once, the world saw what I saw. The man who never gave up on his students. The man who changed lives without asking for anything in return. You deserve this." The old teacher wiped his eyes, trying to hide the tears that slipped through. "I just wanted to help kids pass algebra." Keanu smiled. "You helped them pass life." A week later, when Harold was strong enough to walk again with assistance, the hospital staff gathered at the entrance. Former students stood with balloons and hand-drawn signs. A young girl held a cardboard cutout shaped like a chalkboard that read, "Thank you, Mr. T." As Harold stepped out, aided by a cane, applause erupted. Some clapped, others cried. And in that moment, something unspoken happened. He didn't feel old. He didn't feel forgotten. He felt seen. And in his heart, Harold knew this wasn't just a farewell or a celebration of the past. This was a beginning. What he had built inside the 4 walls of a classroom was now free, growing beyond boundaries, planted like seeds in the hearts of others. It was no longer just his legacy. It belonged to the world. The air buzzed with energy. The plaza outside the new National Harold Thompson Education Initiative building was filled with thousands of students, teachers, parents, reporters, and dignitaries from across the country. There were American flags lining the walkways, photos of Harold from his classroom days displayed on giant banners, and a large stage centered beneath a white awning. It had been exactly 1 year since Harold's collapse in that small community tutoring room. A year of recovery, a year of transformation. Keanu Reeves stood just behind the curtain near the back of the stage. Dressed in a simple black suit, he watched quietly as the crowd gathered, most of them unaware he was even present. He didn't care about being recognized. This wasn't his day. It was Harold's. And Harold, despite needing a cane now, stood tall just inside the building's main corridor, waiting for his cue to take the stage. The National Harold Thompson Education Initiative was no longer just a program, it was a movement. With over 40 chapters across the country and more than 5,000 mentors trained in Harold's methods, the program had been adopted in schools from New York to rural Oklahoma. Students struggling in underfunded classrooms now had someone who believed in them, someone who saw them, just like Harold had always done. The MC took the stage, her voice projecting across the plaza. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today not just to open a building, but to honor a man whose quiet legacy has reshaped lives across the country. A man who never chased fame, but found it in the most meaningful way through love, discipline, and belief in every student he met. Please welcome the man of the hour, Mr. Harold Thompson. The applause was thunderous. Some in the crowd stood. Others held signs that read, "Thank you, Mr. T," or "Harold changed my life." Keanu swallowed hard as Harold emerged from the side aisle, walking slowly but proudly. His eyes scanned the sea of faces, recognizing dozens, maybe hundreds from years past. Former students now in their 30 seconds, 40 seconds, even 50 seconds. He reached the podium and paused, gripping its edges. The applause continued a few seconds longer before slowly fading. "I don't know what to say," Harold began, his voice cracking just slightly. "I was never very good at speeches. I was always better with a piece of chalk in my hand." A gentle wave of laughter rolled through the crowd. "I spent most of my life in small classrooms," he continued. "Places where kids thought they weren't smart enough, where they felt invisible, where they'd already been counted out. And my job, what I believed, was that they could learn, that they mattered, that with enough time and love, they could do more than they thought." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "I didn't plan for any of this. I never imagined one of my students would become a movie star, or that he'd care enough to remind the world of a forgotten teacher." Keanu dropped his gaze as Harold spoke those words, feeling both pride and humility crash against each other in his chest. "I've made mistakes," Harold said. "I wasn't always kind to myself. I thought I was too old, too broken, too late. But this year changed me. You all changed me. And this building, this initiative, it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to every teacher who stayed after school, every student who kept trying, and every person who believes that second chances aren't just for kids, but for all of us." He stopped, tears welling. Harold reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of notebook paper, the kind he used to hand out for math quizzes. He unfolded it slowly and held it up. This is a letter a student once left on my desk," he said. "It was anonymous. It said, 'Thank you for seeing me before I saw myself. You saved my life without knowing it. I never found out who wrote it. But today, looking out at all of you, I realize something important.'" He let the paper rest on the podium. "You all saved me. Each of you. Your stories, your messages, your voices. You reminded me that what we do echoes far beyond the classroom." The crowd rose again, clapping and cheering louder than before. There were tears across the plaza. A middle-aged woman clutched her child to her chest. A young teacher wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her blazer. Behind the stage, Keanu stayed hidden, his arms crossed, jaw clenched to keep his own emotions at bay. When the applause finally calmed, Harold turned toward the front row. The first several rows were filled with some of the earliest students he'd taught, many of them now educators, doctors, social workers, entrepreneurs. They smiled up at him like children again. "I was just a teacher," Harold said softly, almost to himself. "But maybe that's enough." The crowd didn't need another cue. They stood again, this time as one. The roar of gratitude was deafening. One by one, speakers followed Harold's remarks. Education officials announcing expansion grants, alumni offering stories of resilience, even students from the newest branches of the initiative sharing what Harold's methods had done for their confidence. But none of them outshined the moment he created. When the ceremony ended and the ribbon was cut on the new national headquarters, Harold was escorted through the crowd as people reached out to shake his hand, thank him, hug him. The sun broke through the clouds above, casting a warm light across the steps. Inside the building, Keanu finally emerged, not taking the main doors, but walking in quietly through the side hallway. He entered a room filled with photos of Harold's life, his first classroom in 1972, black and white group shots of students, a chalkboard with handwritten equations. In the center, under glass, was the anonymous letter Harold had read. A staff member approached Keanu and handed him a guest badge. "Thank you for this," she said quietly. "He would have stayed invisible without you." Keanu shook his head. "No," he replied. "He was never invisible. People just stopped looking." Later that evening, Long after the speeches were done and the crowd had thinned out, Keanu and Harold sat together on a quiet bench outside the building. The stars were starting to come out. Harold looked over and chuckled. "I'm not sure I deserved all that." Keanu smiled. "You didn't ask for it. That's exactly why you did." They sat in silence for a long moment, both men older, both changed. One once forgotten, the other once searching. Now, together, they had built something that would outlive them both. The sun rose gently over Los Angeles the morning Harold Thompson took his final breath. He was 87 years old, his body frail but his heart full. He didn't pass away alone. At his bedside were people who loved him deeply. Keanu, Harold's niece, and several of his former students, now adults, with lives shaped by the wisdom of a humble man who once taught 8th grade literature. In the days leading up to his passing, Harold had become quieter, more reflective. He would often sit in his favorite chair near the hospital window, watching the leaves rustle outside, murmuring phrases from poems he used to teach. Keanu stayed with him nearly every day, taking breaks only to step out and bring Harold's favorite ginger tea, or read aloud one of the old student letters that Harold never tired of hearing. In his final hours, Harold's voice had grown soft and raspy. He reached for Keanu's hand and whispered, "You made it matter. You made me matter." Keanu held his hand firmly and replied, "You always did. The world just needed reminding." That night, the lights in several schools across the country were dimmed for a moment of silence in Harold's honor. The Thompson Learning Centers now expanded to over 30 locations held assemblies in his memory. Students recited their favorite lines from classic novels Harold once championed. Teachers wore pins that said, "Teach like Thompson." And former students flooded social media with stories of how one man had changed their lives by simply believing in them when no one else did. But perhaps the most moving tribute came not from dignitaries or officials, but from a child in South Dakota. On a video shared millions of times, a young boy stood before his classmates and said, "Mr. Thompson never met me, but the way he taught other kids helped my teacher believe in me. And now I want to be a teacher too." Keanu watched that clip alone one evening, sitting on his couch with a blanket draped around his shoulders. No spotlight, no camera crew, just quiet tears streaming down his face. The next morning, Keanu visited the small grocery store where this entire journey had begun. He stood outside, looking at the bench where Harold had once waited, hoping someone might give him enough dignity to listen. The store had since added a plaque to that bench. It read, "Here sat a teacher whose lessons reached the world. Harold Thompson, 1936, 2024. As people walked by, some recognized Keanu, but said nothing. They just nodded gently in respect, sensing something sacred in the stillness. He stayed for a while, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the quiet street ahead. Later that day, Keanu visited a newly opened Thompson Learning Center in Portland. It had just launched its first mentorship cohort, a group of underprivileged kids paired with former students of Harold who had become leaders in their own right. One was a civil rights attorney. Another was an inner-city school principal. A third had started a nonprofit dedicated to literacy access. The energy in the room was alive with purpose. Walls were covered in student artwork inspired by books they'd read. Quotes from Harold were written in careful lettering around the entrance. And in the corner, a small bronze bust of Harold sat atop a pedestal. Below it were the words, "Truth always outlasts noise." Keanu stood off to the side, just observing. A young girl, no older than 10, approached him with wide eyes. She looked up at the actor, unsure if it was really him. But instead of asking for an autograph or a selfie, she asked, "Did you really know Mr. Thompson?" Keanu knelt to her level, smiled softly, and replied, "Yes, and I was lucky to be his student too." That moment would later go viral when the girl's teacher captured it on video. But Keanu didn't care about the attention. What mattered was that Harold's message was spreading further than either of them could have imagined. The foundation in Harold's name had now reached across state lines. Teachers in Atlanta, Detroit, and Albuquerque had reached out asking for materials, training, and mentorship. Former students began funding scholarships in Harold's name, many of them anonymously. One school district even proposed renaming a high school after Harold Thompson. Keanu met with educational leaders and quietly donated resources to accelerate the expansion. But he stayed out of the spotlight. When asked why he declined interviews or media features, he simply said, "It's not my story. It's his." In his private journal, Keanu wrote something simple but powerful that week. We don't always get to choose the legacy we leave. But sometimes, if we're listening, life introduces us to someone who changes what legacy means. That quote eventually found its way onto the inside cover of every Thompson Learning Center student journal. Keanu never signed it. He didn't want his name there. But the message resonated. Back in Los Angeles, a special ceremony was held in Harold's honor just months after his passing. Former students flew in from all over the country. One by one, they walked onto the stage and shared stories, not about test scores or grades, but about feeling seen, feeling heard, feeling capable. Keanu watched from the back row, hands folded in his lap. When it was his turn to speak, he declined. Instead, he nodded to the host to skip his portion and gave the spotlight to one of Harold's earliest students, a retired grandmother who stood at the podium and simply said, "This man taught us how to live." That was enough. Months later, Keanu found himself walking past the same grocery store where he'd first met Harold. The sidewalk looked the same. The lights buzzed faintly overhead. But everything felt different. He paused, staring at the bench where Harold once sat alone, unaware that his life was about to change, just as he had unknowingly changed so many others. Keanu took a deep breath, a quiet moment. No camera, no crowd, just reflection. In his heart, he whispered, "Thank you, Harold." And then he walked on, leaving the shadows behind. Have you ever met a teacher who changed your life? Share your story in the comments. What should Keanu's next unforgettable act of kindness be? Let us know below.